Hello everyone, we are so excited to have you join us for today's office hour on AWS Certified Associate Solutions Architect exam. My name is Tia Gamble from Cloud Academy, and I'm so excited to introduce our very special Cloud Academy guests. Together, these men have over 40 years of IT experience across software development, cloud engineering, cloud infrastructure, and technical training/writing. I would love to welcome our senior AWS content creator, Carlos Rivas, and our senior AWS certification specialist, Danny Jesse.
Thank you so much, Tia. As Tia said, my name is Danny Jesse. I'm very pleased to be joining you here today to talk about the AWS Certified Solutions Architect Associate SAA C03 exam. And I am joined, as Tia mentioned, by Carlos Rivas. Carlos, would you like to say a quick hello to everyone?
Hi, everyone. My name is Carlos, and nice introduction there, Tia and Danny. Thank you for that. And yeah, I'll be here supporting you with any questions that you may have around this particular topic. It's a really, really special one for me. This is the very first certification that I took many years ago, and it has kept evolving over time. So really excited to share this knowledge with you.
Absolutely. So without further ado, we will dive into our agenda here. So we're going to start by talking about just some of the details around the exam, as well as the exam requirements. We'll break down the domains in the exam guide, as well as some of the assessment points that will be covered in the exam. We'll talk about a little bit of strategy in terms of approaching how to tackle the exam questions as you see them, as well as the details around booking your certification exam. And we'll talk a little bit about in-person versus remote proctoring as well. Then we'll go through some frequently asked questions, and with the time left at the end, we will do a live Q&A. So just to get started, the latest iteration of the Solutions Architect Associate exam, again, SAA C03, was released back in August. And just like other associate level exams, it has a minimum passing score of 720 out of 1,000. So the questions are weighted. It is a weighted score overall, and you do need to have that roughly translates to a 72% correct rate to pass that exam. It is a total of 65 questions, and you will have 130 minutes, so 2 hours and 10 minutes to answer those. And of those 65 questions, 50 will affect your score, and there are 15 that are unscored. Of course, they don't tell you which ones are scored and which ones are unscored, but of those 65 questions, only 50 actually count towards your score. All of the questions are multiple choice. Many of them will have 4 potential answer options, of which you will choose 1 correct, but there are also some multiple response questions as well, and those will be questions where you have 5 possible answer choices and you need to choose 2. Or in some cases, 6 possible answer choices where you need to choose 3. And the exam costs $150 US. Carlos, anything you want to add around that?
No, that sounds about right. Just wondering, one question though. You mentioned about the passing score being 720. Does that mean all questions are weighted equally? So just getting 3 out of 4 correct and then keeping it that way, it should be a passing score. Is that correct?
The AWS kind of keeps those details of how the questions are weighted under wraps. So the best that we can do, even us here at a partner company like Cloud Academy, is really just say, yeah, roughly around that 75% mark. But again, the questions are weighted differently. And it's worth pointing out that with those multiple response questions, there's no partial credit. So if it's a choose 2 or a choose 3, and you only get 1 or 2 of those options correct, that question is going to either be completely incorrect or completely correct.
I see. Yeah, that's definitely a good point because it's not going to be evaluated by a human. This is just automated scoring. You get your score pretty much right away. So whatever it is what you get. You don't get partial credit.
That's right. No partial credit, unfortunately. So now we will go through the exam guide, and there is a link to the official AWS exam guide at the top of your screen here. But the exam is broken down into 4 distinct domains, and those domains are design secure architectures, design resilient architectures, design high performing architectures, and design cost optimized architectures. So no surprise, it's a solutions architect exam. All of the domains revolve around designing architectures that are going to run in the AWS cloud. So what we're going to do now is go through each of these 4 domains in a little bit more detail. Again, these are all broken down in that official AWS exam guide document. But what we're going to do here, what you see at the top above the focus points, within that exam guide, each of these domains has a series of task statements. And those task statements are what we spell out at the beginning. And then in the focus point section, we're going to dive a little bit more deeply into the types of questions you might see or what services and other areas to focus on as you prepare to tackle this exam. So Carlos, you want to talk us through domain 1 here real quick?
Absolutely. So in this particular domain, we're going to be focusing on security, because AWS, for them, is like really a #1 thing, security. There's always going to be like that. It doesn't matter whether you're talking about DevOps or solutions architecture, security is going to be #1. So of course we have Cognito, IAM, and organizations here. Now, of course, that translates into secure workloads and application, and of course, applications are gonna need tons of services, including encryption and firewalls and things like that. So they need to be aware that you understand, at least at a high level, all of these concepts or how to use these services in a given architecture. Now, of course, the next point going from there is to determine what would be an appropriate security control. So it's not only, oh yeah, of course, this architecture requires a firewall, but why are you putting a firewall there? What is the use case? Does it fit what you're trying to accomplish here? So, and now going into specific focus points, you have IAM, as I mentioned. We're going to be talking about roles and policies and for example, SAML as well for single sign-on. Cognito, if you're actually developing your own application, you're definitely going to be looking at Cognito as potential source of authority for your users there. And as I mentioned, firewalls. Once you have something out there in the web and you get a question, hey, what do you do if you're getting denial of service attack? Well, that's when web access firewall comes in, and you're going to see a lot of that. Now, finally, internally managing your AWS account is also very, very important. So you're going to see a lot of config to track your EC2, see how everything is doing. CloudTrail to manage every single activity that is happening in your environment. You need CloudTrail, which is going to basically give you a play-by-play of exactly what's going on in your environment. And finally, encryption. So KMS is going to be your source when it comes to encryption, particularly at-rest encryption. We're going to talk about in-transit encryption in another area, but KMS is going to be your source for encryption at rest.
Absolutely. And, security is so foundational to everything across not just AWS, but certainly the AWS certifications. There's, of course, even the AWS specialty, security specialty certification as well. Typically, the questions you're going to see in a Solutions Architect Associate level exam are going to center around, as Carlos mentioned, really knowing all those details and the use cases for these different services. But specifically also just understanding things like the principle of least privilege access. So you'll see sometimes questions will ask you, how do I grant access to another account to be able to read objects from an S3 bucket? And you might be given choices such as, defining an IAM role that gives full access. And obviously full access would give you that read access, but is that necessarily the best way to do that in accordance with least privilege principles? And of course, the answer would be no. You would look to grant only those permissions, just minimal sets of permissions based on what's required and really nothing more. Also, like you mentioned, when it comes to securing web applications, being able to leverage managed services such as Shield and WAF for distributed denial of service protection, protection against, when you see in a question something like common web exploits or SQL injection attacks and things like that. Your mind should be heading towards using a solution such as AWS WAF. So that's domain 1.
One more thing before we move away, Danny, is I wanted to mention that Cognito can also be used to access AWS accounts. So you can use Cognito to request temporary credentials that allow people to use actual AWS services, not just your own custom web application. So keep that in mind that Cognito can also be used just like you would use AWS SSO, for example, to log into your environment. That's an option that you have, so that might come up.
That's a great point. So looking at domain 2 here, we're going to move from secure architectures to resilient architectures. So now we're going to be talking about really designing for high availability, leveraging the AWS global infrastructure to, through the use of availability zones and regions for fault tolerance, designing scalable and loosely coupled architectures. So really understanding the principles of elasticity, auto scaling, obviously elastic load balancing, things of that nature. So you see some of the services of interest there on the right-hand side. I mentioned the AWS global infrastructure, really understanding what a multi-tier architecture is. So understanding you have, in terms of deploying web applications, you have that load balancing tier, you might have application servers, database servers, how to structure these things in public and private subnets, again, to, minimize the blast radius in the event that, something were to go sideways, if a component were to fail or there were to be some sort of issue. And really being able to quickly restore operations in the event of a failure as well. So looking at using things like Route 53 for DNS, understanding Route 53 routing policies, using Amazon CloudFront, and some of the benefits that can provide in terms of user experience, in terms of latency, but also, again, tying into security. You're not going to see questions that are going to address these domains distinctly, right? These questions are always going to kind of branch across domains. So security with a CloudFront distribution in front of a website hosted in an S3 bucket, for instance. And then, so that ties into the storage services. And obviously, disaster recovery, business continuity runs kind of as a thread through all of this as well. Thoughts on that, Carlos?
Yes, I'd like to talk a little bit about Route 53 and CloudFront. Route 53 has a ton of strategies that are available to you when it comes to delivering content in a fast way to your end users. So they might try in an exam setting, they might try to confuse you by saying, can you use Route 53 geolocation or latency-based routing? And, they might make it sound like they're talking about CloudFront. So keep that in mind. CloudFront is the actual service that delivers content as close as possible to your end users, not Route 53. Route 53 is just there to route traffic in a super efficient way, but they will try to make you, think one or the other so that to get you confused there. So keep that in mind.
And that also is a common theme throughout the exam. Obviously, having that exposure, they're checking to see that you, have some real world experience, that you've been through the console, that you've looked at some of these services, that Route 53 is used for DNS, that CloudFront, can be used with a content distribution delivery network, things of that nature. So be on the lookout for those types of distractors where they might use a real service, but maybe not in a way that's consistent with the use case that you would expect. And those are typically, when we talk about how to tackle these questions and eliminate the incorrect answers, right out of the gate, that would be one way to go about doing that.
Exactly. And Danny, there's usually two distractors that can be eliminated fairly quickly if you know what to look for. But we're going to get into that a little bit later, but just be aware of that. They usually come in pairs, the questions
Right.
and distractors.
Absolutely right. So moving on to domain 3, designing high performing architectures. So again, you see all of these individual task statements begin with, determine, design high performing scalable storage solutions, elastic compute, database, network architectures, data ingestion and transformation. So again, we're looking at things like auto scaling, load balancing, S3, RDS, all of those types of services as well. But when we talk about performance, you'll notice that they don't really delve into what specific performance metrics we're talking about. They're pretty intentionally vague with these. And I think the idea here is just to make sure that you have that level of familiarity with all of these services to know what it might mean to have a better or faster database solution, storage solution, based on the requirements that are going to be outlined within each of the individual questions.
I'd like to jump in here, Danny, to mention that this is the first time that we see one of those keywords that are very important to AWS. In this case, is performance. The opposite of performance most of the time is going to be cost effectiveness or cost savings. So whenever you see performance, try to avoid the response that has the lower cost. Usually something that performs at top level is going to be the more expensive solution. So if a question asks you, what solution would you give that is the fastest performing, try to avoid the lower cost options.
And that's a great point. In the real world, we have to make these kinds of trade-offs with our architectural decisions that we make for our customers and in our own applications and environments. But in the context of the exam, you're going to be presented with questions, and they're generally, to their credit, going to be very clear about whether the answer they're looking for is the best performing solution or perhaps the most cost optimized solution, which leads us directly into domain 4, which is to design cost optimized architecture. So it is a bit of a continuum. Generally, that performance does come with a price tag and a cost. So again, we're going to design cost optimized storage, compute, database, and network solutions and architectures. So again, knowing the storage costs for things like your different storage classes in S3, understanding the use cases for Glacier and Glacier Deep Archive, understanding the pricing models. And again, the pricing models different from the pricing specific. So the exam questions are never going to ask you what is the on-demand rate for a T2.micro in US East 1, right? It's never going to be to that level of memorization. But it is going to be knowing conceptually the difference in pricing models between on-demand or reserved instances or spot instances, spot fleets, things of that nature. So really understanding, based on the nature of the workload and the requirements that you're seeing, how can you do this in the most cost-optimized manner?
And Danny, I know you mentioned that as a joke, the pricing for EC2s, but something that people need to keep in mind is that at least be aware that on-demand is the most expensive. Reserve instances, they go down a little bit because you get a discount, and spot instances are the cheapest. You at least have to have that level of understanding when it comes to pricing, and also consider auto-scaling group if it's a possible response to the question. Use auto-scaling because you can get a ton of compute power at a lower cost when you combine spot instance pricing with auto-scaling groups. So just something to keep in mind if they ask you to optimize for costs.
Absolutely, and that sometimes can even play into when do your resources need to be actually up and running. So if you have a workload that doesn't need to be running consistently, if it runs on a schedule, for instance, maybe some of those other models might be a better fit than just a traditional on-demand model or a reserved instance.
One point that I like to stress here, now that we were talking about S3 and Glacier and all that stuff, is that you may be asked to have that automated. And when it comes to automating storage solutions for costs, you have lifecycle policies. Just keep that in mind when it comes to using S3, because files can pretty much move through the various tiers in S3 on their own if you set up the proper lifecycle transition policies.
Absolutely. So those are our 4 domains. That covers what the exam guide expects you to know going into the exam and what you should feel comfortable with before you sit the exam. Now we're going to take a little bit of time and talk through just strategies for how to actually tackle these questions as you see them. And again, it's a 65-question exam. You have 2 hours and 10 minutes, so you have roughly 2 minutes per question. Something to keep in mind as you're going through this, there is, as you sit and take the exam, whether it's in person at a testing center or remotely from home, there's a timer that's running in the top corner of the screen. You'll be able to see how much time is remaining of that 130 minutes as you take the exam. So you want to be sure that you're allocating, roughly 2 minutes per question, maybe a little bit more for some, but a little bit less for others. As you go through these questions, you want to obviously begin by reading the question in full. And then from there, strip down any information that is not relevant. So a lot of these questions are, multiple sentences, sometimes a couple paragraphs in length. Not quite as complex as what you might see on some of the professional level exams, but sometimes they do get a little lengthy, and sometimes most of that information may or may not be relevant to what's actually being asked within the question. So, and when we go through some of the sample questions here in a minute, we'll see some examples of that. So you want to be sure that you're clear about what the question is actually asking for. Don't necessarily get caught on a certain keyword that you see in the first couple of sentences. Typically, it's the last few words of the question that are really going to drive home what it is that the question's asking. Again, that could be best performing solution, most cost-effective solution, things of that nature. Like Carlos mentioned, typically there's going to be at least one or two, usually two, obviously incorrect answers. And they're going to be obviously incorrect if you have that experience and exposure to these services to be able to recognize what is obviously incorrect. Because if you do go in unprepared, if you don't have that experience necessarily to really understand all of these different services, oftentimes all of the answers are going to look plausible in some way, shape, or form. So this is really, I think, where they can separate the folks who have that experience, have that knowledge coming in versus somebody who's just coming in cold and thinking that they can just kind of reason their way through some of these things. I'd say once you've done that work of eliminating those obviously incorrect answers, go back and reread the question again in light of that. And sometimes that can help you pick out other details that you didn't catch the first time reading through it. And most importantly, don't ever leave a question unanswered. There's no penalty for guessing. Whether you leave a question blank or you answer it incorrectly, it's going to count against you the same. So since they are all multiple choice or multiple response, it always pays to at least guess something for each question.
I have a little bit of a different strategy, Danny. I usually start with the question. By that, I mean, what is the most cost-effective solution, for example? And then I would, once I have the question in my head, I'll try to go back and read the scenario, knowing exactly what I'm looking for now. And then, as you mentioned, then I would go to the distractors and say, okay, now I'm between these four choices, I'm looking what could possibly be the cheapest. And of course, I would find the ones that are expensive and just cross those out right away, and just in the end, hopefully end up with two plausible answers, and then go from there. It's important to know something to stress here is that, just like Danny mentioned, most of these are going to sound very, very plausible, all the options. So if you're completely unfamiliar with that service, or you've never done any actual real world AWS work, a lot of these answers are going to sound like very, very good, all of them. So that's why it's hard to just guess your way through the exam. So yeah, it's going to come down to one or two keywords in those responses there. But yeah, they're going to be, I'm sorry to say, they're going to be very, very plausible. So it's good to at least be high level familiar with every service that we describe here. Otherwise, you might be stumped. But like Danny says, you can just flag it, come back to it later, but don't spend 5 to 6 minutes on a single question, because then you might end up in time trouble. And that's even worse. So you don't want to do that. You want to keep it moving.
And particularly in the early going, I know Carlos and I chatted a little bit about this yesterday. You want to maybe try, especially in the first few questions, to not fall too far behind on your time. If you're spending 5 or 6 minutes per question through the first 10 questions, then you're really kind of putting yourself behind the 8 ball when it comes to getting through the remainder of the exam in time. So, try to confidently trust your instincts on some of those questions, and make sure that you've allotted enough time for yourself to get through all 65 for sure. So without further ado, let's go through, I think we have 3 sample questions. These are taken directly from the AWS exam guide sample questions that they provide. But these are good because I think they're representative of the types of questions that you will see on the exam, and also helps us to kind of walk through some of these strategies with you here today. So for the first question, a company runs a public-facing 3-tier web application in a VPC across multiple availability zones. Amazon EC2 instances for the application tier running in private subnets need to download software patches from the internet. However, the EC2 instances cannot be directly accessible from the internet. Which action should be taken to allow the EC2 instances to download the needed patches? So it tells us to select two, and when it is a multiple response question, they will make that clear in the question whether there's 2 or 3 correct answer choices. So in this case, our 5 choices are: configure a NAT gateway in a public subnet, define a custom route table with a route to the NAT gateway for internet traffic and associate it with the private subnets for the application tier, assign elastic IP addresses to the EC2 instances, define a custom route table with a route to the internet gateway for internet traffic and associate it with the private subnets for the application tier, or configure a NAT instance in a private subnet. So typically with these multiple response questions, you'll see that each of the choices will fall into probably one of 2 parts of what the correct solution is. So in some ways, even though this is a single question with 5 answers, you really will be able to divide them into 2 sets of answers, each of which will have one of the answers that contributes to the 2 choices you need to make. So in this case, you'll notice that one of the answers is to configure a NAT gateway in a public subnet. The other one is to configure a NAT instance in a private subnet. So we know in all likelihood that those 2 are not both the 2 choices that we're going to choose. We're probably going to select one of those 2, and maybe even one of the 3 if you throw in option C here as well. And then you see some kind of repeated words and phrasing in answers B and D as well. So in all likelihood, I'm probably going to be choosing one from A, C, or E, and then the other one from B or D. How would you tackle that from there, Carlos?
Yeah, that's definitely a great strategy that you just described there. For example, you mentioned B and D. You have to define your routing in some sort of way here. But going back a little, let's take a look at the NAT. It's very, very tempting to say, well, my instances are, they don't want to be able to access the internet directly, so they're in a private subnet somewhere. So it's very tempting to go towards the very last choice here, where it says configure a NAT instance in a private subnet. But yeah, that would be incorrect in this case. The same goes for option C, where you would say, well, I can assign an elastic IP, and yes, that would sort of work. But again, that would violate part of the questions where it says that EC2 instances cannot be directly accessible from the internet. So as soon as you put in a public-facing elastic IP, now you're breaking that part of the question. So it's just little keywords to look for. But in this case, as Danny said, we're picking between A, C, and E for this answer, and by elimination, we could end up configuring a NAT gateway in a public subnet. In this case, it's possible to set up a NAT instance in a public subnet. That would work too, but again, that's not one of the choices here. But as you can see, they can combine certain keywords to make one of these distractors sound like a very plausible, very tasty choice to lure you in, right? But in this case, a NAT instance and NAT gateway, Amazon is always going to choose prefer NAT gateway in this type of situation. And of course, if we go down to the subnet level, the public one is the only correct choice here between A, C, and E. What do you think, Danny?
That's right. So now I've got one of my choices down, and I know I still need to choose a second one between B and D. So both of those start with define a custom route table with a route. So I know I'm going to need to do that as part of this. Now the question then from there is, am I going to be routing to the NAT gateway and then associating that custom route table with the private subnets? Or am I going to be defining a custom route table with a route to the internet gateway? Well, we've already determined that we need a NAT gateway for these instances in the private subnet to be able to download those patches from the internet. So I'm inclined to say that I'm probably going to need to do answer B and define a route to the NAT gateway and not the internet gateway. Does that sound right to you?
Absolutely, yes. When you make choices here, it's like you said, you're following a list of steps, and they just throw all the steps in here so that with a few distractors to try and confuse you. But yeah, if you create a NAT gateway, chances are that the next step is going to be related to choosing the NAT gateway, of course.
So that's our first sample question. Let's move on to the next one. A company uses Amazon EC2 reserved instances to run its data processing workload. The nightly job typically takes 7 hours to run and must finish within a 10-hour time window. The company anticipates temporary increases in demand at the end of each month that will cause the job to run over the time limit with the capacity of the current resources. Once started, the processing job cannot be interrupted before completion. The company wants to implement a solution that would provide increased resource capacity as cost effectively as possible. What should a solutions architect do to accomplish this? And the choices are: deploy on-demand instances during periods of high demand, create a second EC2 reservation for additional instances, deploy spot instances during periods of high demand, or increase the EC2 instance size in the EC2 reservation to support the increased workload. So this is another example of a fairly lengthy question. There's a lot of detail here. And in this case, most of the detail provided in the question is relevant. There really isn't a whole lot we can strip out here that's not relevant to what's being asked. So let's kind of break this down a little bit. There is a data processing workload that runs every night, takes 7 hours to run, must finish within a 10-hour time window. There's some increase in demand, some spike in activity that happens at the end of each month that's going to cause it to run over that time limit with what they can accomplish with their reserved instances. So how can they make up that capacity that they still need to complete this job as cost effectively as possible? So with that in mind, going through what we had talked about before, understanding those pricing models for spot instances, for on-demand instances, for reserved instances is crucial. Knowing those differences is crucial to arriving at the answer here. But there's one little wrinkle in that. Obviously, we know that the spot instances would provide us the lowest cost option between spot instances, on-demand, or reserved instances. But there's one little nugget in the question that tells me that that might not be the right answer in this case, even though we're still looking to do this as cost effectively as possible. And that's the piece of information that says, once started, the processing job cannot be interrupted before completion. So why might that rule out our spot instances?
Yeah, I'm guessing, Danny, that rules out spot instances right away, right?
That's right. So, and this is where they're again testing your depth of knowledge. Someone who just immediately makes that recall, spot instances are the cheapest ones, I'm choosing answer C. But wait, do you really understand the nature of how your spot instance reservation works? Do you understand that that capacity could be reclaimed before your workload is complete? That you're not guaranteed to have that spot instance for the full time that you might need it. And because it says, the processing job cannot be interrupted, which is what would happen if you were running a spot instance and then AWS reclaimed that instance. So what would I need to do in that case?
If you can't use spot instances, then of course you're down to either the reserve or the on-demand in this case, and I'm leaning very much towards the on-demand in this case because you just run it for the fixed duration. Would I be correct in that?
You would be correct. And so even though your on-demand instance is going to cost more than a reserved instance, when you only need it for this period at the end of the month, few hours at a time, you don't have the ability to purchase a 3-hour reserved instance at the 3-year reserved instance rate, where
Exactly.
that would be then potentially the most cost effective option. Because those reserved instances are locked into those longer term commitments, getting an on-demand instance for a few hours a day for a few days a month is going to be the most cost effective option.
Yeah, those reserve credits are for longer term commitments, not just hours.
So let's do one more of these. An application running on AWS uses an Amazon Aurora multi-AZ DB cluster deployment for its database. When evaluating performance metrics, a solutions architect discovered that the database reads are causing high I/O and adding latency to the write requests against the database. What should the solutions architect do to separate the read requests from the write requests? And your choices are: enable read-through caching on the Aurora database, update the application to read from the multi-AZ standby instance, create an Aurora replica and modify the application to use the appropriate endpoints, or create a second Aurora database and link it to the primary database as a read replica. So now we're talking about database performance, and the question is pretty clear. What should the solutions architect do to separate the read requests from the write requests? So how might we tackle this for a question about Aurora?
I really like this question, Danny, because this is mostly like traditional solutions architecture. This not necessarily tied to AWS, even though we're using AWS services. But even if you work 100% on-prem, you would potentially at some point in time face this type of scenario like in real life, right? Where you have all these transactions coming to a database, but then you have a ton of users just generating reports and running store procedures and doing SQL queries and all that stuff. And that's just going to slow down your database, which is there to capture information, not just provide read-only reports, right? So what would you do? Try to go back to, let's say that you were a software developer, or perhaps you have a background in operations. What would you do in that case if you were faced, remove the cloud from the picture? What would you do? So let's go through these options here. You have read-through caching. Well, that sounds kind of okay, but you're still on top of the same database. You're kind of just moving the problem from one side to the other. You're still in there somewhere. Let's see, what else? Update the application to read from the multi-AZ standby instance. Also, that doesn't sound great. That's supposed to be there for DR reasons, disaster recovery reasons, not to satisfy read requests. So, that's not a great use for the standby instance. Option C, create a replica and modify the application to use the appropriate endpoints, and create a second database and link it to the primary as a read replica. Of course, as I mentioned, I really don't like option A and B for reasons. Option C and D, they both mention the word replica. So one of these is going to be the answer. What do you think, Danny?
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think this is, again, even though, the question doesn't explicitly mention anything about cost, obviously there is a clear cost difference between creating a second Aurora database and even just kind of the technical feasibility of maintaining a solution like that.
Exactly.
And is it really even possible to do what they're saying in terms of linking it as a read replica to the primary database? Lots of red flags with that answer. So I would be inclined to say the answer is C, to create that Aurora replica and modify the application to use the appropriate endpoints. And this, again, is going to test your knowledge, your understanding of RDS multi-AZ deployments, knowing that, that multi-AZ standby instance, as you mentioned, is there for high availability in case there's some sort of an outage in a particular AZ. There isn't really a good way for you to direct some portion of the traffic to the standby instance. Really, that's just there for those failover purposes. So really, when you're talking about scaling read demand, that's where using an Aurora replica comes into play, and being able to offload that read traffic to be able to help with that problem, which, as you'll recall from reading the question, was that there was latency in the write requests against the database. So the best way to address that, obviously, is to direct that read traffic elsewhere. The replica is made specifically just for that. So answer C is what we're looking for here.
And by the way, if this question was related to web services or a web server, or perhaps caching content, the answer would probably involve either CloudFront or Memcache or Redis or something like that. Is just think of adding a layer that can allow people to read information without costing you I/O on the actual resource. In this case, of course, this question is a database, but it could be something else, like a web server or something like that.
Absolutely, and you will see questions like that as well. So moving on, that's giving you hopefully a taste of how to tackle some of these sample exam questions that you'll see. Now let's talk about some of the logistics behind actually booking the exam. So first and foremost, you will need to have an AWS training and certification account. You can go to aws.training/certification to create that account. And through the end of calendar year 2022, you do still have the choice between PSI and Pearson VUE. But AWS did announce a few weeks ago that beginning January 1st of next year, 2023, all certification exams for AWS are going to be delivered through Pearson VUE only. When you go to the Pearson VUE Testing Center, you will need to present 2 forms of ID, at least one of those being a government-issued photo ID. And going back to, since 2020, when obviously some things changed and folks needed to start being able to take these exams remotely, they do offer remote proctoring for these exams, for all exams as well. I know a few years ago, you could take the cloud practitioner exam via remote proctoring, but none of the others. But since 2020, you're now able to take all of the AWS certification exams via remote proctoring. But I know, Carlos, you have a pretty strong opinion, and so do I actually, about whether remote proctoring is really your best option. Do you want to talk a little bit about your thoughts on that?
Yes, of course. Remote proctoring is not something I recommend, especially if you're a person, taking an exam for the first time, perhaps in many years. You can get nervous or make some kind of mistake, or perhaps you're just like me. You just like verbalizing what you're reading on screen. You like to verbally read the question that you're answering, and that's really not gonna be something of it's going to be a very stressful point for the person proctoring your exam. They're going to say, hey, what are you doing? Are you communicating with somebody else in the room? Are you trying to cheat the exam? And that can add additional stress to you that you don't really need at a time where you're trying to pass an exam. So I highly recommend, if possible, just show up to a center. They leave you alone. They give you a computer and a quiet environment. They really don't mess with you at all, unless of course you start, they have cameras. They can see, of course, everything that you're doing, but it's a lot more relaxed than trying to be at home, like super quiet. And Danny, I have a question for you here. Is it possible even at all to take restroom breaks when you're taking an exam remotely from home?
As far as I know, no, it's not. And to be clear, when you're doing this remote proctoring, you are being watched via webcam for the entirety of the exam. And I have taken some exams via remote proctoring before. My preference by far is to go to the in-person test center for just that reason, right? You get that flexibility. If you need to raise your hand and use the restroom, the testing centers have protocols in place that will allow you to do that, because they're able to tell, you've surrendered all of your phones and any of your study materials and things like that. You can be escorted to and from the restroom. At home, you obviously don't have that flexibility. You're being watched via webcam. Even if you stand up or look away from the screen, that's going to trigger potentially, the proctor saying, "Hey, you've violated the terms of this remote proctoring. We can't proceed." And certainly, when you're at home, you could have internet connectivity issues, you could have a power outage, you could have a rogue Windows update. They've installed agents on your computer, obviously, to make sure that you're not recording your screen or doing anything along those lines. But any one of those things could potentially go wrong and potentially cause you to disqualify that attempt at the exam. And generally, I understand they're pretty flexible about allowing retakes and things like that, depending on the nature of what's happened. But if that's a situation that you can avoid, I would prefer to just go to the test center and avoid all of that. So moving along here, we have about 15 minutes left in our hour here together. We've compiled a list of frequently asked questions based on just the types of questions that we're often asked about certifications, and specifically the Solutions Architect C03 certification here at Cloud Academy. So for starters, I mentioned that this latest version of the exam was released back in August. And people want to know, how different is this exam when compared to the predecessor SAA C02 exam? And I will say, having sat SAA C03 a few weeks ago, it's a very incremental update from SAA C02. If you have been studying for the prior version of the exam but didn't get an opportunity to take it, I would confidently sit this exam, this version of the exam as well. The questions are of similar complexity. The only real difference, and you see the two exam blueprint, the domains side by side, you see, in fact, the domains between C02 and C03 did not change. There were really just some very incremental changes to some of those percentage weightings. The only real difference that I've been able to see is that there are a lot more services that are considered, what they would call in scope for being eligible to have questions asked about them on the exam. And really the biggest one is that the biggest category of services are the machine learning services. And don't get intimidated by that. It really is just having a very high level understanding of the basic use cases associated with each, understanding what Amazon Textract is and what it's used for. Obviously, as the name suggests, extracting text. Understanding, maybe Amazon Lex for conversational chatbots, things of that nature. Really nothing too deep in terms of training ML models using SageMaker or anything really crazy like that. Really just having that high level understanding of those services, I think is enough to get you through. Anything you want to add about that?
Yeah, I believe you already answered it for me, Danny, which is, let's say that we're talking about Textract. Do I need to know like which model should I pick for a given text extraction, or just like understand what the tool is and does, and is that enough?
That really is enough. The types of questions I saw would be really the use case is very clear, and then it's just, do I understand that Textract is the service that does that and not Kendra or Recognition or things like that.
Got it.
Really
Okay.
just having that kind of recall level knowledge of those services is really all you need.
Okay. Yeah, because it comes down to being a core solutions architect. So core meaning compute, storage, and security. So those are going to be your areas of many questions, right? When it comes to machine learning, they might throw that in there to see if you know what the service is, but they're not going to go into deep, because even those services, they depend on compute and storage and all that stuff. So they really focus on you knowing how to architect a solution, not into the specific details of the solution itself.
Absolutely. And you'll see below the two domains there, I do have a link to a blog post that I wrote back when the exam was initially announced that kind of delves into some of the differences in a little bit more detail. The next question is, what should a novice know before taking the exam? Well, pretty much everything, right? I say that in jest, but you do need to have more than just a foundational knowledge, more than just a vocab level knowledge of AWS. And as you see here, what we're saying, understand cloud computing from a fundamental perspective. And if you're completely new to AWS, I know you had mentioned, Carlos, that this was your first AWS certification, but what I recommend for a lot of folks is actually, if you are completely new and this is your first AWS certification, maybe consider pursuing the AWS Certified Cloud Practitioner certification first. And I typically recommend that for a couple of reasons. One, it gets you that level of familiarity with AWS exams in general and the way that they go about asking questions, the way that you can kind of reason through the answers, eliminate distractors, things like that. But then the other reason is actually kind of financial in nature. So the Cloud Practitioner exam is $100. We mentioned that the Solutions Architect is $150 US. But whenever you pass an AWS certification exam, one of the benefits you receive is a 50% off voucher for your next exam. So by paying $100 and passing the Certified Cloud Practitioner exam, you then get 50% off your next exam, which then brings the cost of your Solutions Architect Associate exam down by half to $75 US. So now you're paying $25 more than you would have to get that Solutions Architect Associate right out of the gate, but you've gained that exposure, you've gained that experience taking exams, you've validated your foundational knowledge of things, and just making that experience sitting this exam, I think, that much easier.
That is an absolutely brilliant strategy there, Danny, for sure. Especially knowing that the cloud practitioner is going to get you familiar with the exam taking process. It's going to be stress-free. I remember taking that exam, and for me, it was like 30-something minutes of just clicking through questions, just really understanding the high-level concepts, really what AWS is, what autoscaling is, what do you do, how do you contact support, and if you get in trouble, things like that. So it's a very good starting point, as Danny mentioned, because from there, now you have the proper mindset. When you do take this exam that we're talking about here today, you will already know the UI, know the interface, know how to, mark questions, go back to questions, review your exam, all that stuff. You'll be very, very comfortable going into this particular exam. And just, that will save you a ton of time. In itself, you might save maybe an additional 5 to 10 minutes, but those are really critical when you, as we mentioned before, if you get caught up in a few questions that you really want to answer, but they're taking too much time, and in the end, having an extra 5 to 10 minutes, just because now you're really familiar with the interface, it really helps.
Absolutely. And just to build on that, obviously being aware of the core services within those foundational areas, compute, storage, database, network, and security, and then going through those sample questions. And again, there's the link there. So how should you go about preparing for the exam? Well, obviously you want to give yourself enough time to consume all of the learning materials available to you. We're going to talk about our learning path here at Cloud Academy. But obviously you want to be able to review those things more than once as well. Usually the first time through, you're really just getting a feel for the material, getting a feel for terminology. You want to gain that hands-on experience in conjunction with that as well. Like I said, you're going to see these distractors are going to often be very plausible. And the only way that you're really going to be able to go about eliminating wrong answers is to have had that hands-on experience, that firsthand knowledge, working with these services in the console, really doing more than maybe just reading, through some documentation to really understand those things. And then be honest with yourself, identify where your weaker areas are, and spend some more time in those areas as well. And that can involve reaching out and asking questions to other AWS users, to us here at Cloud Academy. I'm going to talk about our study channel on Discord here in a minute. That's another great resource. But study, and definitely consume our learning path. The link is down there at the bottom. We've curated a series of video courses, hands-on labs, lab challenges, knowledge checks, and a practice exam that will really get you prepared to sit and pass the exam.
Hey, Danny, you mentioned along with this is to have a real world experience with AWS. How much do you think somebody needs before jumping into taking an exam?
Yeah, there's no hard and fast rule for this, and there's certainly no prerequisite for any of the AWS certification exams now, in fact. But if you read through the AWS exam guide, they'll recommend 1 year of hands-on experience. The issue I take with that is that for different folks, depending on the nature of the work that you do, hands-on experience can look very different for different people in different roles. That could be anything from, if you just are focused on one particular element or one particular service as part of your day job, maybe you're really solid on the networking side of things, but you're not going to have exposure to maybe some of the database services or some of the content delivery or DNS type services. Whereas somebody else might have a more broad base of knowledge, broad base of experience, and maybe after just 3 or 6 months, they would be in a better position to take this exam. So no hard and fast rules. It can be 0 for sure. AWS recommends 1 year, but again, kind of know that hands-on experience is going to look different for different folks. And with that, that's the end of our frequently asked questions. In terms of Q&A, that's what's come in during the course of our hour here together. I see for multiple choice questions, you're saying there's no partial credit if one of the choices is correct. Unfortunately, yes, you do have to get, if it's a choose 2, you have to get both. If it's a choose 3, you have to get all 3 right, or the entire question is counted as incorrect. And then what's the difference between associate and professional certs? Well, the professional certs are certainly more broad in scope. They're going to feature longer questions. You're going to have longer answer choices as well. I actually just sat the updated Solutions Architect professional exam yesterday, and my mind is still a little bit of mush from going through that for a little over 3 hours. In fact, you'll see that many of the answer choices in the professional level exams tend to be paragraphs long as well. And for the professional certs, AWS usually recommends, I believe, two or more years of hands-on experience. It really is just an entire order of magnitude more difficult in terms of the scope and the degree of difficulty of the questions.
Danny, for me, the difference between the two is that the associate level will quiz you on concepts. The professional is actual real life scenarios that you have to answer. That's what I noticed the most. And of course, what you
Absolutely.
mentioned, the questions being super long as well.
Absolutely. And then it doesn't seem like we have any other live Q&A questions. Definitely feel free to ask those via the Q&A panel. I do have a couple more slides here to go through in just our last couple minutes together. Again, I do want to call your attention to our learning path here at Cloud Academy. The link is there. So again, 11 courses, 21 hands-on labs, 3 hands-on lab challenges, 16 knowledge checks, and those knowledge checks are broken down by core area. So you'll take the compute video course, you'll do a couple of hands-on labs related to compute, and then you can do a knowledge check. And that's really good so that you're not going all the way through this learning path and then just finding out when you take the exam, where some of your deficiencies might be. This really helps you to identify those weaknesses so that you can go back through them before you start to tackle the next area. And I think the hands-on labs, especially if you are potentially in a situation where you're not going to have the ability to get that hands-on experience at work, the hands-on labs and the lab challenges are really great for giving you practice in a real environment where you're not going to break a production system or cause what they call a resume generating event or anything like that. We give you the keys, we give you the credentials to play around with these services and really learn and gain that hands-on experience.
Danny, it seems like we have quite a bit of questions there.
I see a few have now piled in. Yes, thank you all. So the best strategy to select multiple choice answers. So we talked a little bit about this. Usually if it's a choose 2 or a choose 3, you're going to be able to identify what 2 or 3 topics they're looking to have addressed by those answers. So really you can turn a 5 response choose 2 into 2 separate, okay, it's going to be one of these 2 options and one of these 3 options. And then you're really just treating it as a 50-50 and maybe a 1 and 3 instead of a 2 and 5. Practice papers for the Solutions Architect exam. So we do have a link to the AWS resources there on the sample questions that we looked at, as well as the exam guide. We have obviously the knowledge checks and the preparation exam in the learning path that's linked on the screen as well.
And Danny, do we have practice exams at Cloud Academy?
We sure do. So at the end of the learning path, there is a timed exam experience that's meant to mimic the real life exam. You're going to have 2 hours and 10 minutes to answer 65 questions. And what I really like about this is that it's not just a bank of 65 questions. So you can take this exam once and then take it a second time and you're going to see different questions. We have a question bank that's very large and comprehensive in nature to really help you identify, again, where your deficiencies are, give you that experience in a timed environment with the types of questions that you're going to see on the exam, give you a feel for kind of where you're falling in terms of that percentage correct, whether you're in that passing realm or not as well. Let's see what other questions we have here. So which Cloud Academy course will be best for the associate level? Definitely go to this learning path. The learning path that's linked on your screen here will have all of the courses that you need, and they're broken down again by those core areas with associated knowledge checks and hands-on labs as well.
And Danny, we keep getting this question. Are you sure there's no partial credit if I answer half the questions?
As much as it pains me to say, I am sure, yes.
Yeah, even if you answer 3 out of 4, you're gonna, it's gonna be incorrect.
Let's see. After the video, next best information resource. So yeah, so definitely looking at service user guides, AWS white papers, well-architected framework, frequently asked questions for the services tend to be pretty ripe for where you'll see exam level questions come into play, blog posts, AWS blog posts as well. Free or less expensive hands-on AWS experience. So there is the free tier. Anyone can sign up with a credit card for the AWS free tier, and there are a number of services that you can really kind of try and gain that exposure and that experience within the free tier.
And also read the AWS provided white papers for each service. That's also free, but it's going to take you a lot longer time than using the our resources that are already curated and set for exam purposes.
Is the learning path enough to pass the exam, having cloud practice? So certainly if you pass the security specialty, that is one of the more difficult AWS certification exams. If you have taken and passed the security specialty, Solutions Architect Associate, obviously security is just one domain within this exam, but that you definitely, by passing that specialty exam, you have the awareness of the difficulty, the degree of difficulty of these questions, the complexity of things that might be asked about. You'd certainly be on the right path, and certainly going through our learning path and all of those resources would prepare you, absolutely. In the event of failure, if you do fail the exam, you do have to wait 14 days to retake it. Let's see, more preparation exams. So like I mentioned, even though it is just a single preparation exam at the end of the learning path, the question bank is very comprehensive. So you can actually, retake that exam multiple times and you will get different questions every time.
And yes, you're allowed to wear your mask if you're testing on site, so don't worry about that.
And if you did complete the C02 learning path, that really gets you, 95% of the way there, if not more. Really just supplementing that knowledge with, just making sure you understand kind of at a use case level. You might see one or two questions about maybe a machine learning service here or there. But again, certainly nothing too in-depth about that. You're well on your way to being prepared for C03 as well. For the hands-on labs, so we have hands-on labs and we have hands-on lab challenges. And in the hands-on lab challenges, it really is a pretty unrestrained environment. The hands-on labs tend to guide you through a series of steps to perform a specific task with a specific output that gets validated. The lab challenges are really more taking the gloves off and giving you just a single goal to accomplish and then turning you loose within the console. Let's see, did I miss any questions here? I've seen a few others pop up.
They're mostly similar to what we've been discussing, so in a way, we've already answered.
Well, great. I certainly appreciate your time today, and thank you, Carlos, for helping me out here. I'll go ahead and turn things back over to Tia now.
Lovely. Thank you, Danny and Carlos. That was a fantastic overview. We really appreciate your time and sharing your expertise with us. And at this point, this concludes today's webinar. We hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you again for joining us. Thank you again, Danny and Carlos. You guys were awesome. And everyone have a good evening.